අපි මීළඟ සංවාදය වෙනුවෙන් ආරාධනා කරේ අමල් අබේවර්ධන මහත්මයාට. එතුමන් එක්සත් රාජධානියේ සර්වපාක්ෂික පාර්ලිමේන්තු කණ්ඩායමේ ලේකම්වරයා ලෙස කටයුතු කරනවා. ඒ වගේම සර්වපාක්ෂික සමුළුවේ ලේකම්වරයා විදිහට කටයුතු කරනවා. ඒ වගේම ශ්‍රී ලංකාව සහ එක්සත් රාජධානිය අතර යහපත් සම්බන්ධතාවයක් ගොඩනැගීම සඳහා සෑම අවස්ථාවකම පාර්ශ්වකාරයෙක් ලෙස කටයුතු කරනවා. ඒ වගේම ශ්‍රී ලංකාව තුළ සාමය සංහිඳියාව ගොඩනැගීම සඳහා බොහෝ අවස්ථාවන් වල මැදිහත් වීම කරන සිවිල් සමාජ ක්‍රියාදරයෙක් විදිහට ජාත්‍යන්තර මට්ටමේ කටයුතු කරන පුද්ගලෙක් විදිහට අපිට ඔබතුමන්ව හඳුනා දෙන්න පුළුවන්. ආයුබෝවන් ඔබතුමන්ට.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon to everyone. It's morning here in London. And I'd like to thank very much the Centenary movement for inviting me, and Prashant particularly for putting me into this symposium. By way of background, because I don't think many people know about me, I am the secretary to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sri Lanka. And let me just talk to you a little bit about that group. So the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sri Lanka, should we say APPG for short, was founded in 1975 by Michael Morris MP, a conservative parliamentarian representing Northampton in the UK, when he first entered Parliament that year. He is today better known as Lord Naseby, Michael Naseby, who I think many of you have possibly heard or read about even in your papers in Sri Lanka. Because he has a strong connection and affinity with Sri Lanka and all its people, and has been promoting Sri Lanka in the British Parliament for several decades. He's just a quick plug, and he has recently released a book about himself and his life with Sri Lanka called Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained. And it was launched last month in Colombo, and I was privileged enough to be there in Colombo for that. So Lord Naseby originally started his life working in Sri Lanka actually for a couple of years, and that's how his affinity for Sri Lanka began. He forged a strong friendship with Ananda Tissa Dialvis, and they both agreed to enter politics in their respective careers in their respective countries. Ananda Tissa Dialvis became an MP, I think, in the late 70s and 80s, and emerged to become Sri Lanka's speaker. And Michael Morris rose to become a deputy speaker in the 1990s in the British Westminster House of Commons. In 1997, Michael Morris became Lord Naseby and entered the House of Lords as a Conservative peer, and he's still there. So that's the All-Party Parliamentary Group is a cross-party collection of parliamentarians in the House of Commons and the House of Lords in Westminster, and brings together people who have a strong affinity for Sri Lankan issues and want to contribute towards strengthening bilateral relations between Britain and Sri Lanka on various fronts. I should also mention that there are two other all-party parliamentary groups that are connected to Sri Lanka. One is for the Tamils, and one is for the Sri Lankan Muslims, which is called the APPG on Cosmos. So that's by way of some background. And I also want to talk a little bit about diaspora engagement, because I think your members may be interested to know about developments amongst the Sri Lankan diaspora communities, especially in the UK, and their reactions to what's happening in Sri Lanka recently. So I want to just reflect on what these events that are happening in Sri Lanka mean to someone living outside Sri Lanka and their impact going forward. So first of all, I think there's a real opportunity now for a rebirth of a nation, the rebirth of Sri Lanka, and for all her people, wherever they may be. This symposium is on economics. However, I will be focusing on the political landscape necessary to build a thriving economy in Sri Lanka. I'm speaking from the UK, where I've lived for over 50 years. But as I said, I was fortunate enough to be in Sri Lanka over the last 4 weeks, and I've only just recently returned. And so I was able to witness the extraordinary events in Sri Lanka over the recent weeks at Galle Face and elsewhere around the island. These are momentous events that have generated several other Sri Lankan protests around the world, including in London and other places where the diaspora communities live. The world is watching these events with renewed interest in Sri Lanka in the hope that a new dawn has arrived. So from my perspective, what do these protests actually mean? I want to share my thoughts as someone living outside Sri Lanka. Fundamentally, there's a call for the removal of the current president, but more broadly for a political system change where the current democratic architecture, considered by many as flawed, is able to be replaced by one that is more inclusive, better functional, and far more accountable. These protests have been spontaneous and without any obvious leadership, at least not from any current political party. They show no sign of ceasing, and because they have been peaceful and at considerable scale and spread, the government seems unable to answer or to quell or dissipate them at the current time. The protesters have been demanding solutions to various issues as the country faces bankruptcy, with citizens seeking a bleak future amid shortages of fuel, cooking gas, and other basic essentials, such as milk powder and medicines. They blame their plight on the government, which is accused of gross corruption and maladministration. In reality, I think it's fair to say that the problem that Sri Lanka is facing is based on a long legacy of failed administrations in Sri Lanka. And I think Indrajit, who spoke before me, perhaps articulated that quite clearly. So given the broad consensus that is gathering, Sri Lanka needs to have a renewed foundation built by people of honesty and integrity who accept that they need to be held accountable by the people who elect them. There's a widespread call for a repeal of the 20th Amendment and a return to the 19th Amendment, which gives greater powers back to Parliament and more scope for independent commissions and the judiciary. A consensus is also building for the abolition of the executive presidency. Now, as someone who's living abroad, I'm really an observer. I would applaud such progressive moves, but these are ultimately decisions for people of Sri Lanka to make. Nothing has changed so far, but there's much anticipation that things will be changing in the future. But perhaps those changes constitutionally are not enough. Sri Lanka needs to look far more carefully at all its governance systems and structures. The legislature and the executive needs to be held better to account. Checks and balances need to be introduced to counter allegations by citizens of gross financial corruption. Particular attention may need to be paid to the funding of political parties, as well as asset declarations for those who enter Parliament. We need to move away from Parliament being restricted to the arena of people from political dynasties or those who have amassed fortunes from unknown sources. We need to see how a new generation of people dedicated to public service, especially those with specialist skills, may be able to enter and play a significant role in Sri Lanka's leadership. We need to see greater inclusivity in those that represent the nation at the highest level. It has been inspiring to see Tamils, Sinhalese, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, and Christians coming together at these gatherings. in a true living demonstration of our national flag. They know that the great diversity of Sri Lanka's people should be seen as a strength, not as a hindrance. I would like to draw everyone's attention, as I've already said, to Indrajit Kumaraswamy's thoughts on the economy. His insights are a way forward for the economy and are comprehensive and insightful. My additional thoughts are that we need to build a stronger base. We are an island nation that has great connectivity, that needs to be a successful trading nation that is fundamentally export driven. And I think the previous speaker articulated those thoughts very neatly. We need the proceeds of our nation's earnings to be shared amongst all our people. No community or region should be left behind. Poverty should be assigned to the past. We need to have a foreign policy that is in synchronicity to our economic aims. We should not be in a situation where the countries who contribute most to our foreign trade earnings are pointing accusatory fingers at our human rights record. Sri Lanka needs to face many challenges, not least from climate change, but these can be met. Sri Lanka can be a pioneering nation for renewable energy and be a net zero country. There are ample renewable energy solutions all around us to make Sri Lanka actually a net exporter of energy. We have made considerable progress in hydroelectric power, but far more can be achieved in solar and wind, especially offshore wind. We must be bold in entering new areas of commerce. For example, there is huge potential in exploring blue economy opportunities due to our position in the Indian Ocean. We must recognize that the environment is the foundation of our society and our security and prosperity. They need to be nurtured and protected. Therefore, the approach to our environment should be regenerative. Ultimately, the success or failure of projects should be based on their worth to the nation, especially on their impact on the lives of citizens. Job creation will be a key criteria going forward. The current negotiations with the IMF have just started, but Sri Lanka needs to look beyond just the immediate needs of solving the foreign exchange shortfall. We need to have a long-term national economic strategy, and a lot of thought needs to be going into that development of that. It needs to be built on good governance and sustainability. Our people need to have great public services, not just on education and health, but a reliable safety net that addresses the needs of those living in poverty or just above it. Foreign investors will not be interested in just tax breaks or other gimmicks to enter Sri Lanka. Investors seek jurisdictions where their money is secure and where the legal systems are robust and independent. Investors also need to be sure that the human rights of their citizens in their country are upheld. To make real progress in Sri Lanka's economy, especially international trade and exports, a settlement needs to be reached on the legacy of our domestic conflicts and the reasons that cause them. This is particularly of interest to the Sri Lankan diaspora communities. We need to see a country where there are more people who want to enter the country than those who wish to leave. Our parents need to see greater opportunities for their children within Sri Lanka than outside. We need to see better schools and universities in Sri Lanka so that more students seek to stay within the country than traveling abroad. Ultimately, we need an enabling environment that encourages our citizens to stay in Sri Lanka than seek employment abroad. We should not be living on inward remittances as a major source of our revenue. In my opinion, Sri Lanka's rebirth can be achieved, but it cannot be achieved if we deny the addressing of our human rights legacies. We need to make a serious attempt at a truth commission. This would be the ultimate healing process that brings our communities together and addresses whatever things that have happened in the past. Addressing our past is critical to our future as a successful nation. I'd like to end there and thank the Centenary movement for the opportunity to speak to you, and look forward to greater engagement with your members and answering your questions later today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abeyawardene, for those insightful thoughts. I think to get a perspective on what the diaspora is, what the perception is of Sri Lanka right now, and also to have received, the kind of prerequisites in terms of political reforms and a conducive environment that we should enable in Sri Lanka towards the economic recovery. I think, thank you for those points. I would like to right now open up for any questions from the audience. I think there was earlier, before, while we were waiting for more questions, Mr. Abeyawardene, there was a question earlier that had been raised by a colleague when Dr. Kumaraswamy was speaking about the possibility of raising a patriot bond, kind of getting our diaspora to, to invest in a long-term, financial instrument. So for those kind of, innovative options, what is the kind of appetite of the diaspora and, friends of Sri Lanka from abroad to invest in Sri Lanka at the moment?
As I think Indrajit explained, there's an enormous amount of goodwill for Sri Lanka everywhere, not just amongst the diaspora community, but elsewhere. The problem has been the instability in Sri Lanka. And as I said earlier, the ability to have independence in your judicial systems and in ensuring that law and order is paramount. So people will not really be, the bonds that you're talking about, they have been attempted in the past to limited success. But it's based much more on the ground realities of what's happening in Sri Lanka, and whether that can be made to be seen to be more progressive.
Understood. So you also spoke about the blue economy on sustainability. I think earlier last year, the UK hosted the COP26 on climate change. So I think, and given there's Sri Lanka's potential to contribute to this area, there's also talks about Sri Lanka structuring debt for climate swaps and debt for sustainability swaps. How likely are we able to get the support of the UK government and the financial sector there to support? We do understand, as you mentioned, that there's a lot of things that need to improve in terms of our investment environment, but in terms of technical assistance and capacity building, how likely are we to get some support, especially from the UK where you are?
I think there's enormous potential. I'm personally working on a blue economy initiative, and I think there's a lot of scope for Sri Lanka to benefit from investment in those areas. Sri Lanka is an island nation with enormous resources around it in its marine environment, and it's a question of working with international interlocutors and looking at the opportunities and agreeing on terms.
Thank you very much.
I see a very, very positive future in that area.
Thank you so much. Good ප්‍රශ්න තියෙනවාද අපේ audience එකේ ප්‍රශ්න තියෙනවා නම් මේ අවස්ථාවේදී අපිට යොමු කරන්න පුළුවන්. අපේ chat box එකේ දාන්න.
My apologies, my Sinhalese and Tamil are very poor.
It's okay. We could translate any questions that the audience has into English. So please do
Sure.
share any questions in the chat, and or also, I mean, you can raise the question. We can translate it. So please feel free to raise any questions. In the meanwhile, so in terms of the kind of the structural adjustments, the improvements in the judiciary and our legal system, what are the kind of, I mean, to the aspects that you mentioned we need to rectify. For those aspects, where can we get further support? And I think you mentioned that Lord Nasby has been advocating for Sri Lanka. So in that respect, in the foreseeable future, based on the actions that you're taking right now, do you foresee any immediate intervention support that could come our way?
Yeah, sure. So ultimately, I think Sri Lanka's prosperity will be based on its success as a international trading country, and the export earnings that you raise through that. To really get and enhance that, you need to be, most of your earnings, export earnings, come from the West currently. So these are unfortunately the same countries that are pointing fingers at Sri Lanka on its human rights record. So there needs to be some accommodation on these. And these are the countries, by the way, that are sometimes threatening sanctions on individuals or and so on. So we need to come to a settlement on this. I honestly don't believe, and Lord Naseby certainly doesn't believe, that Sri Lanka has committed any major international crimes. But his belief is not sufficient. We need to go through a process that addresses these things. Now, as I think I mentioned earlier, we've made some progress with an Office of Missing Persons, an Office of Reparations, a Human Rights Commission. You've got a right to information legislation as well. I think you need to you need to live up to the recommendations of your own commissions. So things like the LLRC and the Paranagama Commission. Those recommended the setting up of a truth commission. Britain, for example, will be soon recommending a truth commission to address its own issues in Northern Ireland and the conflict that arose there. So there's an enormous synergy for Britain and Sri Lanka to work together on such initiatives and learn from past experience and joint experiences in setting up a truth commission. There's already been some engagement between Sri Lanka and South Africa based on the truth commission that was established in South Africa. And I think much more can be done in that front. I think it'll be interesting to hear from people amongst the Centenary movement how they would like the legacy of Sri Lanka's human rights to be resolved. I would say that a truth commission is the next best step.
Thank you, Mr. Abeyawardene. We need to also conclude, but I think we have one final question from Ayesh Pereira. Ayesh, would you like to share your question?
Yeah, sure. So I have two big questions for you, sir. I really enjoyed your talk. So how would you respond to those, especially in Sri Lanka, who would contend that the very concept of human rights is actually a colonial intervention employed by the...
Sorry, Ayesh, I'm finding it difficult to hear you. I don't know if anyone else is able to hear you.
Yeah, Ayesh, I'm also having difficulty. Yeah, couldn't hear you properly. So, yeah, Ayesh, could you repeat that, please? I think his line just got cut, but I think he's trying to get back in.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, much better. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed what you shared. I have two brief questions. First of all, how would you respond to those, especially in Sri Lanka, occupying positions of authority, who constantly argue that the concept of human rights is actually a Western neo-colonial invention utilized by the West to impose it to exert its influence upon Sri Lanka and to subjugate it? So that's my first question. How would you respond to such rhetoric? And secondly, having lived in the UK for nearly 50 years, I assume you're intimately acquainted with the policies of the Thatcher government, which managed to spur economic growth in the United Kingdom, like through balanced budget reforms and a radical departure from Keynesian policies towards the monetarist policies of Milton Friedman and so forth. So do you think those could be adopted here, or that they merit any form of attention in discerning what to do amidst this crisis?
Okay, Ayesh, those are two very good questions. So let me try and address this. Look, human rights should not be seen as purely a Western construct. I think we need to address within what it means to have our human rights. And I think the protests actually quite clearly demonstrate that, because I witnessed people in Galface. So, you know, these are people who are demanding that their rights for political expression are heard. And they seem to be thinking that they've been denied that throughout our independence. So, you know, this is them articulated that in the most democratic way possible for them. So these protests are a living embodiment of the fact that human rights need to be protected. And these protests have nothing to do with any colonial intervention in Sri Lanka. These have come purely from within. Does that answer that question?
There's also a second question.
Yeah, of
Sure.
course. Conveying that to the leaders here might be, somewhat difficult, but that indeed is a clarification, and I think that logically explains the position as well concerning human rights.
Indeed, and just broaden that. You know, it cannot be right for our own citizens to enslave other citizens within our country in whatever way, or treat people in any discriminatory way. And that's what human rights is about. We're talking about equality, and we're talking about, you know, treating each other civilly. And that should be how it should be seen. And I saw great hope and inspiration from those people gathered, as I said, in a very inclusive way towards their fellow citizens. Okay, so moving on to the sort of Thatcherist question that you raised. You know, Britain's economic growth and political growth is quite different from Sri Lanka's, and I would be I'd be wary of taking another country's, shall we say, initiatives and importing them directly into Sri Lanka. I mean, I think by and large, Britain's center of gravity politically is right of center. We've, in the last 50 years, we've only had Conservative or Labour leader in government. And although there has been a Labour administration in government between, I think, 98 to 2010, the leader of that, Tony Blair, is widely considered to be right of center. So the point I'm making is that it's very difficult for a left of center party to emerge as government in the UK. In Sri Lanka, my perception is different. So it seems to me that the vast majority of members of parliament of all the political parties are left of center, and some are very left of center. Okay, so that probably reflects where the people of Sri Lanka are politically. Now, so you need to come up with solutions that cater for that democracy, for that electorate. So that's why I was saying that, you know, at the moment, I think Indrajit also mentioned this, you don't have a a great welfare state. You have something like free education and health, but beyond that, you don't really have an inclusive welfare state. You have a Samodya system, which I think is hugely corruptible because it relies on certain political patronage for it to be delivered. So you probably need to construct a welfare state that's based on people's needs. And then based on that, you can build forward. I mean, I would encourage that kind of progress to be initiated. But at the same time, as a right of center person, I'm a member of the Conservative Party here, I would want to see a low tax environment, but an environment where the taxation base is broadly spread as far as possible. So on those lines, I would agree there are some synergies between the UK and Sri Lanka, but you need to evolve your economy to a higher level before you get involved in further changes to it, shall we say.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Abeyawardene. I think we have run out of time. So let me hand it over to Prashant to take things. Thank you so much, Mr. Abeyawardene.
My pleasure.
On behalf of the Centenary movement, I want to thank Mr. Amal Abeyawardene for your time and your willingness to engage with all of us. Great insights, especially the fact that you're from the diaspora and you are looking at the economy from a different perspective as well. So thank you for especially talking about the environment and the inclusivity in that, also human rights and Sri Lanka's foreign relations. All of that are important pieces in the journey ahead. So once again, on behalf of the Centenary movement, thank you, Mr. Abeyawardene.
My pleasure, Prashant.